Stories and lessons from people whose lives changed in a heartbeat when catastrophe struck. This is Crisis in the First Person. Here's our host, Howard Price.
And thank you, Andy Field, and thanks to you wherever and whenever you're watching the second installment of our occasional series of podcasts we call Crisis in the First Person. These are stories and lessons from the front lines of catastrophe, from the people who survived them, or in the case of today's installment, managed them. In the wake of two devastating hurricanes in the southeast United States, and the wildfires that have scarred greater Los Angeles, on this installment of our podcast, we're going to be discussing the reignited debate over the future of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and what the new administration wants to do with it. And when it comes to FEMA, our guest today, well, she really knows what she's talking about, knows whereof she speaks. Andrea Davis is a veteran of the agency and one of my dearest friends and most respected colleagues in resilience and crisis management. Following years of distinguished service in the public and corporate sectors, she's gone on to found the Resiliency Initiative, where she currently serves as its president and CEO. Andrea, welcome to Crisis in the First Person.
Thank you, Howard. I'm very excited to be here.
So, Andrea, let's get right to it. You're a certified emergency manager, a business continuity professional, and in your astounding roles with FEMA during Hurricane Katrina, your leadership positions in a number of nonprofit emergency response organizations like the Red Cross, your work at the Federal Reserve and at Walmart and the Walt Disney Company, where you ran crisis management planning and response. It's fair to say you've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to unified response to disaster. You're an emergency management Hall of Famer, and for our audience, yeah, that's a thing. Your role with FEMA specifically during Katrina was sprawling in scope. So tell us what FEMA is and what it's not, and what the average American needs to know about its mission and its process as political debate swirls around it now. And if you could, also explain the response triad on which FEMA rests, the concept that disaster response is locally executed, state managed, and as necessary, federally supported on the basis of the scope of the crisis.
Happy to. And I welcome all of your listeners. I really encourage you to take a look at FEMA and the history behind it, because it has definitely changed through the years. And so in 1979 is when the organization formalized with the sole mission to be focused on emergency management and supporting local entities who've been impacted by something devastating that they could not support on their own with their own local resources. Think about your community. Think about different locations. Do you know your local emergency manager? Do you have one? Most communities, that local emergency manager, especially where I'm based right now in Northwest Arkansas, that emergency manager might also be the sheriff and the mayor. And so when there's a really bad day, like a tornado that comes through that community, the responsibilities and that of making sure the residents of that community are taken care of are going to lie on that local emergency manager and that local government. Where FEMA came into play was saying that the federal government wants to help in these responses, because the government as a whole has a vested interest in making sure all of our communities are resilient, and that when something bad happens, that they build back better and supporting the priorities of that local community. And so from a process standpoint, is like the local will raise his hand saying, this exceeds my capabilities. Hey, state, I need some help. And then the state will intercede and say, here's some state resources, and say, here's what we can offer to you. Now, there's obviously some disasters that exceed the capabilities of a state. And so you look at the recent ones that you cited, Howard, from the LA fires or any of the big hurricanes, Hurricane Katrina. Obviously, it was known even before those impacted the local jurisdictions that the states were going to be at capacity and needed resources. And that's where FEMA comes into play. The president himself has to declare a disaster declaration for that specific disaster, and that opens the door for federal resources, both from a money standpoint, but then also from resources, federal resource support to help with the food, the sheltering, and with that local emergency manager giving you access to all of FEMA's different talents and different divisions and other federal resources. It's not just FEMA that helps with a disaster response. You have HUD come into play, and there's many different agencies. The Small Business Association steps in to help the local business community that's been impacted. FEMA is just that facilitator or coordinator, if you will, for that overall disaster response. And this has gone through changes through the years. I really implore your listeners to take a look at the Stafford Act. That's what I just gave the overview for as far as the process. That's really kind of the governing document. But then there's been reforms. Post-Katrina, we had the Hurricane Katrina Reform Act because the system didn't work. It wasn't meeting the needs of that local community, specifically in areas throughout the state of Louisiana. And so we had the Reform Act to say, FEMA, we need you to respond and help us recover differently. And then fast forward in time after Superstorm Sandy, which I know, Howard, you were impacted when you were at ABC. We saw an iteration of reform to FEMA in their process, trying to expedite the bureaucracy. Because when you think about it, from just being that local EM, and that's how I got my roots. I was in San Francisco with their Office of Emergency Management, which is one of the bigger ones in the United States. But being that local EM and just saying, hey, I just suffered a really bad day, and you want me to fill out like 15 different documents and talk to 15 different government people, both at the state and the feds. I mean, the process is very bureaucratic. So I really think the thought of having a council to review FEMA's work is not a bad thought. I'd actually welcome that for any government agency. I think that's a best practice from the emergency management community. We're all about after action review. You've got to constantly assessing what you're doing to make sure you're on mission, that you are helping the people who need the help.
So, Andrea, the Carter administration creates FEMA in 1979 to serve as, well, the New York Times put it this way recently, the country's 1-800 number for disaster response and relief, a national clearinghouse for emergency planning, coordination, and resources that most states and local jurisdictions couldn't muster on their own. Now, that sounds like a good thing, but take us back to 2005, to Hurricane Katrina, one of the biggest disasters you worked as part of FEMA. What happened to the public perception of FEMA as a result of that catastrophe, and how is it affecting the public and political perception of the organization right now?
I think that was truly a defining moment for FEMA and its history. And just a little in between history, there was a significant change to FEMA with the onset of the Department of Homeland Security. FEMA was an agency that reported directly to the president before Homeland Security. And I think it was either 2002 or 2003 when the reporting lines changed. And so from a timing perspective, when Hurricane Katrina hits, all those thought leaders who had been with FEMA for years were gone. They were in a different agency, and now you have bureaucracy on top of bureaucracy, correct? And Homeland Security was defining its legs on its priorities. And Homeland Security's focus, national security, law enforcement perspective, that's not truly on point for FEMA. FEMA helps people prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. So it was a little bit of a smoosh of the mission. And you see at that time, FEMA start adapting another part of its mission to protect people, which is a variant of what they do. So I do want to make sure that it's clear that there was a significant leadership change for the organization pre-Katrina that had a devastating impact on the response. But that the failing of response was owned by all local, state, feds. The federal government cannot come into a state unless they are asked. There was no federal declaration until days after we even see the devastation. The people are on the roofs. There were some families, they were on the roofs for weeks, Howard. It was a deplorable display of a structure in the United States of America, one of the richest countries. And with the Katrina Reform Act, it was said, right? The people spoke. We're not going to allow this to happen again. But the feeling, it was a true leadership challenge for all organizations. And when you have a local mayor who did not have plans in place to support his community that was completely underwater and not ask for help of the governor, the federal government is paralyzed. And so the thought of saying, blow up FEMA, give the power to the states, it's already there. That's the process. But if along the chain, you don't have the ask for help, you can't, we have posse comitatus. You cannot send in the federal government into a state if they are not asked. Now, the Katrina Reform Act definitely said, hey, you can declare an emergency declaration. We know this is going to be bad. We know feds, we're going to need help. And so FEMA can pre-stage so we don't have the devastation that we saw in Katrina. But you want to have those guardrails. So you do not have a federal government that assumes control too soon and doesn't listen to what the locals need. And we see that with Katrina, Howard, like even as we get into the recovery, and that's when I joined the recovery office down in New Orleans, it was year 5. There were still homes, Howard, with search and rescue tags that said how many people had died there. Can you imagine if you're a child and you're walking past that every single day to go to a school that hasn't been rebuilt because of all of the red tape and because they didn't want to rebuild segregation era schools? Why would you do that? Why would you build a structure that is going to be obsolete the moment you build it? And so you see action, you see the community come together and say, no, this is what we want from the federal government. And it was a petition to Congress to do the recovery school, build a whole recovery school district. It was the first single settlement from FEMA so they could rebuild all of New Orleans school back the way the local community wanted it. But that was 6 years after Katrina. If you are that person who has lost everything, you had to go through the FEMA recovery process and be denied and denied because you didn't have the paperwork. And I'm putting it on this is the individual, not even the public assistant. Can you imagine your impression of FEMA? And you're blaming FEMA, right? Because that's the name. That's where the money's coming from, even though the money is being funneled through the state and to the local government who's made the request. And it's that if you were that person, yeah, you're going to say this didn't work for me. And we're seeing it right now, Howard, in LA. This is 20 years after Katrina. We're seeing this right now with all of the residents, especially in Altadena. It's very similar to me. You had kind of historical home ownership and a historical African-American neighborhood, impacted, lost everything. They didn't have fire insurance. One, they probably would have been dropped anyways. We're seeing the insurance companies do it, but they didn't have it because they didn't have to, because they didn't have a mortgage. They're in an area that the costs, and I know that was my home, that have increased exponentially. So they can't afford to rebuild. And now they're stuck in this process of, hey, I need help. I'm going through the FEMA process and I have to give them all this paperwork, but it just all burnt down.
So, Andrea, I have worked with you for a very long time, and one of the things I've come to appreciate about you is that you not only look at situations in catastrophe as an analyst, as a planner, as a manager, you look at it very much as a human being. I can hear your voice cracking 20 years now after Katrina, 20 years after you were in the midst of that maelstrom, and I can still hear the emotion in your voice. I hear it now when you talk about LA, knowing that you lived there for many years when you were with Disney and before that in San Francisco. These are places and people that you truly love. And I think that this is part of what most people don't understand about FEMA. There are 20,000 people that work for FEMA, and they don't all work in Washington. In fact, there are 10 regional offices that are designed to put FEMA closer to where disasters are, closer to the people who need their services. And I wonder whether or not there's just this great misunderstanding about how the agency works, particularly its disbursement process. We heard a lot of this on social media during the hurricanes. Oh, they're only getting a few $100s, and all this other money's going to the migrants and all this other stuff that was completely wrong and misunderstood about the allocations. And they are buckets of allocations that FEMA gets for discrete purposes. Maybe you can explain that process a little bit.
Well, I'd like to kind of almost put it in the bucket, Howard, of like every year we got to file taxes, right? It's a very arcane process, and archaic, and you have to look at page 352A and make sure it matches to 754B, and so we're used to a bureaucratic process, and there's whys behind that. But again, when you've gone through a bad day, it's really hard to maneuver that process. And yes, FEMA has, from an individual assistance, they're looking at how many people have been personally impacted. They're looking at that totality of the number, at least financially, so they can give individual assistance, IA. And this, again, is funneled through the local Office of Emergency Management up to, sometimes it could be a county relationship, then county up to the state, and making these requests and saying, here's our needs. And it seems like that's so bureaucratic, it takes so long. But as far as like opening those channels and in filing the correct paperwork, if you're familiar with that process, it's easy to do because you know it, just like your taxes. But say you get into with your taxes, you can't do that easy form anymore, and you got to go the standard 1040, or say you open a small business and then your taxes become nutty. You're then into this whole different avenue of process, going from either local, county, possibly state, and then feds. And then from a public assistance or PA, this is totally different buckets. And so think of your city infrastructure, libraries, roads, sewer systems, any like firehouses, police stations, that's in the public assessment bucket. And so FEMA and the state will come out and do damage assessments, usually with an assist with local providers, to figure out, to give a preliminary number of like, how bad is this? Six months ago in my relatively new community for me, we had 7 devastating tornadoes that impacted us. And so within a number of days, we had the professionals come out, both from the FEMA side, state side, to do preliminary damage assessments to kind of get a number of what does it look like. Is this the millions? It's the billions. And again, that just opens up a door to start then this recovery process. And it is just that, Howard. It's a process. It takes a long time. And in this community, in Northwest Arkansas, we've been rather fortunate in not having a lot of large-scale disasters. This was a big deal. Our local Red Cross has 2 staff people. I mean, and so we weren't equipped from even an immediate response to go into this recovery efforts. So think about that from a knowledge of understanding FEMA. If you're a community that, knock on wood, hasn't been impacted by something that has kind of reached through all these, these checks and balances and gotten federal assistance, you don't even have any awareness of what this process looks like until you've lost everything.
And Andrea, I'm going to jump in there because that takes me directly to my next question, which is the current administration believes that drastically reforming FEMA, maybe even doing away with it altogether and sending the money and other resources that it gives to FEMA directly to the states would be more effective and efficient when disasters strike. They say it'd be less costly to taxpayers and would help faster. Do you agree with that?
I don't agree with it. And it goes back to your point, Howard, of saying, I think there's a misunderstanding of process. That is what it is today. The states manage a disaster. It is what it is today. The federal government listens to what the state says are coming from the damage assessments and opens up funding streams. It isn't like FEMA's sitting there holding these resources in purse strings. No, they have to be asked, and they have to go through the process, and the state has to ask them. So I think it's lack of understanding of how it works. And I'm not a proponent of just throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but what I am a proponent of is, hey, let's look under the hood. All of us should be prepared to go through an audit and look at how we've been doing things. Today is not 1979 when FEMA was formed. It is not 20 years ago when Hurricane Katrina happened. We have had lessons learned. Are we using those lessons learned? I mean, it's so hard because, right, an after action review should be done devoid of politics and personal influence and all that jazz. But you and I know emergency management is the most political field out there because it's all about money. And it's all about sometimes who you know and who's the squeakiest wheel when you're going through this process. If you're that local EM, you've never experienced a disaster, you have no clue about the state process or the FEMA process. You have no clue. Who do you think jumps in front of you? That local EM who does know the process.
So, Andrea, I'm glad you used that line, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because that was actually the first few words of my next question. Are there things that states and localities simply can't do, even with more federal money flowing directly to them, that you actually need a FEMA to provide and coordinate? I'm thinking here not only about resources, but about expertise, planning, risk management, assessment, mitigation. Would a better solution be elevating FEMA to a cabinet position, an executive level agency outside the Department of Homeland Security where it currently resides?
I am hopeful that comes out with this council that's been appointed to review FEMA. I do, but since I worked with the agency before it was under Homeland Security, and then obviously for the agency when it was put under, I personally felt that it was much better to be a direct cabinet level position straight to the president. I think there's, again, because this process can be so convoluted and you sometimes will miss the priorities of that local when it gets, the telephone game all the way up to the president. It would give greater transparency on the situation and that you would have more visibility. And sometimes with visibility, you feel like you have more control. And just eyes on the process that I honestly don't believe, something that's been so embedded in our culture. And if you look globally, the resource that we have with FEMA, I just don't feel the right thing to do is rip it out. Again, there's probably avenues, like with anything, that we can make it more efficient. And where your point, Howard, really looking pre-disaster, looking at those hazard mitigation grants that come out, and if you take a hard look at some of the grant funding that came out under Homeland Security, obviously much more to secure, facilities and stuff. But if we could look at some of the lessons we learned from that, because I was in San Francisco when the money was flowing, right, for all Homeland Security things, and millions of dollars. And it wasn't, this is not a bash on local communities, but if you're told, hey, you just fill out this form because this is a high risk area, and even if you're in the middle of nowhere, we're going to give you millions of dollars to buy tanks, people are going to do it. But the problem is now you have all this stuff in the middle of nowhere. No one knows how to use it because the money wasn't for training people. It wasn't for creating plans on how to integrate that into your emergency operation plan, because for the longest time you kind of put security stuff over here as opposed to putting it under, hey, a crisis is a crisis. We have emergency management professionals, almost like where we got with COVID, right? Oh, we're not going to have FEMA, facilitate this national crisis until like 3 months down the road. And I'm like, well, we should go to the people who are professionals. And so I really think it's so layered, and the resources that the states receive today, pre-disaster, are significant. And we're only been kind of all the sound bites, right, have been about, oh, disasters and you should have done da da da. And well, okay, that's great, because we're always going to have finger pointing after a crisis, because one side of the house is going to say you should have done that, and because you didn't listen to me, this is why it happened, which isn't true. Let's take a step back. Have professionals take a look at this. And if there is something broken in one of the streams from a recovery standpoint, from a mitigation, from preparedness, that's my biggest worry, Howard. It's preparedness.
And Andrea, I'm going to jump in there because we're actually running so near the end of the podcast already. This is such a great conversation, but you've just nailed the perfect wrap up. And that is, what's your overarching advice to entities of all kinds, public, private, individual, when it comes to better planning and resourcing for disasters? What are we still not getting about the essential need, particularly for individual and organizational preparedness and training?
Educate yourself. I don't care who you are, anywhere on this planet. Educate yourself about your resources. If you happen to have the best job on the planet, being an emergency manager, know your resources today. Know what funding you can tap into from a preparedness standpoint. Prepare your community. Have simple things about how you notify them. Become that trusted resource today, before the bad day, so they know that to listen to you when you have to tell them to run because there's a fire that has started in the middle of nowhere and they have seconds. You start today. But the hardest thing, Howard, is like when every day is putting out a fire, you don't invest in preparedness. But that is the single most way to really focus on resiliency and recovery is prepare today. And it doesn't have to be extensive or anything. Just you as that individual. If you were to experience loss of power right now, and we're in the middle of this podcast, what would we do?
And Andrea, to that end, on our screen right now are ways that you can help educate yourself if you are watching or listening. It's ways to contact Andrea and her team at the Resiliency Initiative. They are based both in Rogers, Arkansas, which is their main office in the Heartland, and also their headquarters office in Santa Monica over on the West Coast. You can also reach out via email at info@theresiliencyinitiative.com. One more time, info@theresiliencyinitiative.com. And because we follow the rules of three, we'll say that one more time, info@theresiliencyinitiative.com. Andrea, it has been a thrill to reconnect with you and to speak with you. We don't do it often enough. I hope we'll have many more opportunities to do it. And that about wraps up our get together for this episode, our second endorsement, our second installment of the Crisis in the First Person podcast. I'm Howard Price, reminding you that it's only a disaster if you haven't planned for it. Join us again soon. Like us, subscribe, and thanks again for joining us.
Listening to Crisis in the First Person with Howard Price. Please like and subscribe to our podcast for the latest episodes as we post them. Available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.